Welcome to Understanding the Bible with Pastor Stephen. This is Season 5, Episode 12, Proof of God, Philosophy 1.0. So, we're going to be covering a lot of the philosophies that are out there, and we'll be going back in history and looking at some of the famous philosophers like Plato and Socrates and stuff. But I wanted to just briefly touch on what we talked about last time, which was the cosmological argument and the teleological argument, which is basically science. When we talk about thermodynamics and stuff like that, we did that last time on the proof of God. And today we're going to be getting more into the moral argument, the ontological argument, the argument from consciousness, from contingency. I'll mention Pascal's wager and argument from religious experience, although that one is, I'm not going to dive deep into. So let's get started on the definition of philosophy. Philosophy is the systematic, rational study of fundamental questions regarding existence, knowledge, truth, reason, ethics, etc. So there's multiple philosophies. Let's talk about ethics real quick because that was in the definition there. Ethics is evaluating the principles of right and wrong, such as analyzing the morality of euthanasia or justice in your society. So there's a major difference between ethics and morality. Ethics is what society or a group of people have determined to be right or wrong for their group, such as killing people is unjust if they have not attacked you or your property. So we have basic ethics of we don't kill people, right? Unless they deserve it in war or whatever. Now, some American Indian tribes had different ethics. They could kill anybody that was not in their tribe, or they could kill anyone that wasn't in their village. So if someone came to visit and then left, they could go follow them and kill them and take their stuff. Different tribes had different ethics. So my point is, murder is clearly not fundamentally a right or wrong morality that everybody has, because determining based on your society, you had different ethics about who you could murder. Okay. But that doesn't change the fact that in every society, there was certain killing that was considered murder or unethical. So there's a key difference there. Now, in America, we consider it unethical to kill dogs or cats and eat them. Other societies don't. So, for a lot of people, ethics becomes the morality of your society, so that people who grow up in it believe that something that is unethical in their society is therefore immoral. And that's not true. Ethics change based on the society, based on new laws and what the consensus is at that moment in time. But morality is what is right and wrong, regardless of your society, your personal beliefs, or what time period you happen to be in. So we know that slavery is wrong. We get that from the Bible primarily. It's a Western culture phenomena based off of Judeo Christian values. However, in certain time periods, people believed slavery was okay. We know that that has always been wrong, to beat people and force them to work for you in chains and then kill them if you don't want them anymore. We know that morally speaking, that's always been wrong, but the ethics of certain societies allowed for it. So think of this for developing an idea of the difference between ethics and morality. If a society develops that believes having a pet snail is immoral, I know I just made that up. It's funny. But seriously, think about it. If they believe that having a pet snail is immoral, and that's that society, but they also believe that raping a small child is sexually moral, and then their ethics become so ingrained in that society that they literally make laws putting to death snail owners because you're not allowed to have snails as pets. And they make laws that reward child rapists with marriage licenses and the right to rape that child for the rest of their life. You might come up with the legal argument that in that society it's okay for them. Or you might come up with the argument that an adult raised in that society just didn't know any better, so you can't really blame them. They've never seen anything different, right? You could make that argument. Now, I'm not going to argue any of these things. I'm just saying you could logically make these arguments, but you cannot argue that it is morally evil for anyone in any society to ever own a pet snail. You're just not a logical human if you think that because one society did it, that is morally evil for everyone else, and anyone who owns a snail ought to be put to death. I don't think you could find a single person who would argue that. Nor can you argue that because that society does it, it is now morally good and righteous for every adult in every society to rape small children. I don't think you'd find a reasoning adult in any society who would make that argument. So my point is ethics are for groups of people like societies and cultures and countries. They determine their own ethics. But morality, right and wrong, what is truly right and wrong transcends culture. It transcends the laws that you decide to make. Moral evil and moral goodness never changes. For instance, Jeffrey Dahmer here in the United States was a serial killer, rapist, and cannibal. He ate his victims. He may have had personal ethics that allowed him to do those horrible things and not violate his conscience. But nobody can honestly say that they think his ethics were morally righteous and good, and that every good moral person in every society should rape, kill, and eat random innocent people. Are you starting to see the difference between ethics and morality? Anyone can choose whatever ethics they want, but morality does not change. It determines what is good and evil in this world. It doesn't change with people. It doesn't change with societies. It is what is good and right, regardless of what Jeffrey Dahmer or you or I or society makes into laws. So that is one basic philosophy that people need to understand when we talk about philosophies and ethics. And here's a couple more philosophy things. Epistemology, that's investigating the limits of knowledge, how we know what we know, such as the five senses and whether or not something is reliable as truth. Another branch of philosophy is metaphysics. That's exploring the nature of reality, such as examining the existence of free will, which is not a tangible thing, but it's something we conceive of and we act on and we live our life based off of. I have free will. You can't force me, right? Or the definition of what time is. So when you start exploring the philosophy of metaphysics, it originates from the Greek word meta, which means beyond, and physica, which means physical things or nature. So beyond the natural. So we're talking about things, ideas like love. We're talking about the nature of things that are real, but is beyond the physical. All right. Then you have logic. And of course, all of these philosophies actually require logic. So logic is studying the structure of valid arguments and reasoning, which is used to evaluate the coherence of arguments or theories. Now, there's three laws, basic laws of logic that people for all time have understood. The law of identity, it states that a thing is identical to itself. That means if a statement is true, then it is true. What is is. What is not what is not. Something that is real is that thing. I can hold my hand in front of my face. That thing is real. My hand is real. I can make a statement that it is raining outside. If it is raining outside, that statement is true, then what I said is actually is. So reality, okay? What we talk about has to actually have an identity. I can't say that I'm going to discuss philosophy and talk about the movement of my hand if you think my hand is a unicorn and the person next to me thinks my hand is a beam of light and I think my hand is a pencil. That's just not logical. You can't have a discussion about anything, philosophy in and of itself, if you don't have this law of identity, that things are what they are. All right. Then you have the law of non-contradiction. That asserts that contradictory statements cannot be true and in the same sense at the same time false. So nothing can be and not be at the same time. That is logically impossible. So you've heard of Schrodinger's cat. That is a puzzle based on lack of knowledge. It is not reality. And so people try and twist reality and say, well, until I look in the box, I don't know if the cat's in there alive or dead. And so, therefore, at any given time, without looking in the box, the cat is both alive and dead. No, that's in your thought. But that violates this law of logic of non contradiction. It cannot be both true and false at the same time. All right. Then you have the law of excluded middle. These are the three laws of logic. All right. The law of excluded middle dictates that a statement is either true or false. There is no third option or middle ground. Everything must either be or not be. These laws are, when you talk about philosophy or any with the scientific method or anyone with an adult sound working mind, these laws are unavoidable. If you attempt to deny these three laws of logic, it requires that you use the laws in trying to refute them. That's why they're unavoidable. That's why it's called logic. You cannot exist without following these laws of logic. Now, then we have logical fallacies, which we'll get into later. But and one of the other philosophies that we're going to not actually spend a lot of time talking about is personal philosophy. But that leads more into the subjective truth as opposed to objective. And we're talking more about what is and not what you can conceive of in your mind. So, personal philosophy would be I've developed a personal set of beliefs or values that guide how I live my life. All right. Another way of looking at personal philosophy would be like my core values, or I forget the term for it. There's lots of terms for it when you get into personal philosophy. But, anyways, let's talk about making logical arguments because everything hinges on being logical when you talk about philosophy and facts and things that are real. And that's what we're trying to get to is can we prove that God is real? All right. So the three basic laws in logical arguments is identity, what is really is, non-contradiction, nothing can be and not be at the same time, and the law of excluded middle, something must be or not be. Therefore, based on these three laws, God must logically exist or he does not. God cannot be real for you and at the same time not real for me. Now, your personal philosophy aside, I'm talking about the reality of a physical being who is God. Either he is there and he's real for you, and he's also really there for me. I just don't acknowledge him. Or he's not there for either one of us, and you're delusional for thinking that he's real. It's one or the other. There's no middle ground here in logic. So if God does exist, then he exists. That's the first law. And he has real character traits, discoverable attributes, and actions that will help us begin to understand what and who he is. If he does not exist, anything that I think are attributes of God, actions, or evidence must have another logical explanation. There's no two ways about it. Now, when we talk about making arguments, we have logical fallacies, and this is what we don't want to do. When you do a logical fallacy in an argument for God or for whatever it is that you're talking about, um, it kind of invalidates your argument because you are not being logical, and thus what you're talking about is not even real. You're just exploding the argument or the proofs that you have, and you're making a mistake in such a way that a logical person can dismiss you and say you're being stupid. This isn't worth talking about. So you don't want to do these logical fallacies. All right. Here's what they are. Now, there's a lot more, but these are the basic ones. Ad hominem attacks. That is attacking the person making the argument rather than addressing the substance of the argument itself. So you might have heard people say, well, you're a Nazi or a pedo when you make an argument about something. That is an ad hominem attack without any basis in the argument that you're having. So if I'm trying to make an argument that you ought to vote for, some guy in Congress, and you call me a Nazi, that's trying to derail the argument on why I think you should vote for the guy. If you were to say, well, he's a Nazi because he murdered Jews or he hates Jews, then okay, that's not an ad hominem attack. You're using arguments, you're using facts, you're using things that were stated or done to make that attack about his character. That's different. An ad hominem attack is when you make up an argument like calling someone a Nazi or a pedo to avoid addressing the actual issue. All right. So don't do ad hominem attacks on people. The next one is a straw man argument, and that's where you oversimplify or deliberately misrepresent an opponent's argument to make it easier to attack them. So, for instance, when confronted by someone who believes the Bible, if you say, well, I also believe in the tooth fairy, to intentionally laugh at my belief in the Bible and invalidate any of that person's beliefs so that anything you say that's tied to the Bible now I can just dismiss and be like, yeah, you believe in fairies, so whatever, you're stupid. So these are straw man arguments. It's misrepresenting their argument as something else so you can attack that instead of their actual argument. So this might look like this. If I said, I believe abortion is wrong because the Bible says, and then I start getting into God has created you and knitted you in your mother's womb, and God has put all your parts together and designed you and knew you before you were even born, and so on and so forth. And I try and use the Bible verses from the book of Psalms and stuff to say that abortion is wrong. If someone says, "Oh, you got that from the Bible," well, that's okay. You pray to some, dude with a beard in the sky, and I believe in the tooth fairy too. So, whatever. You can have your beliefs. Well, they're trying to invalidate your entire argument about abortion by derailing it and making fun of it and misrepresenting your argument. The next one is a slippery slope. This is arguing that a small first step will inevitably lead to a chain of negative events. For instance, if I say students should not have their phones during lunch, my argument on the slippery slope would be, well, if you allow students to have their phones during lunch, they'll stop paying attention in class later. They'll begin to fail their subjects. They'll never get a job. You want them to succeed in life, don't you? You should take their phones away at lunch. That's a slippery slope argument that really is not logically following one step to the next. Then you have a false dilemma or the either or logical fallacy. This is presenting two options as the only possibilities when more possibilities exist. So you might hear somebody say, if your kids don't go to college, they will never have a successful career. That's presenting the option that either they go to college or they fail at life. There are other options. You know what I mean? You could go to college and fail at life, or you could not go to college and start your own business. I mean, there's lots of possibilities, right? So the false dilemma one is where you present two options and attack those. So you ignore the other possibilities. Then you have the red herring fallacy, which is introducing an irrelevant topic to distract from the original issue. For example, pro lifers shouldn't care about abortion until they solve the foster care system crisis. And that tactic is designed to deflect the conversation away from your actual argument against abortion, like moral or legal issues or science, biological issues, to start talking about the foster care system. And you'll see this a lot in life where people just can't stay on topic. They want to have an argument with you, but the next thing you know, you've forgotten the original argument and you're talking about something else. And that's deliberate. And it's because they can't logically argue against what the original thing was. Let's see. Then we have the hasty generalization, which is drawing a broad conclusion based on insufficient or biased evidence. For example, I met two rude people when I went to Paris, so everyone in France is rude. That is not logical. It does not follow, one does not follow the other. It's a generalization based on one piece of information, and it's not factual. Your conclusion is not factual. And then the worst one, I think, is the circular argument. And that is supporting a premise with the conclusion rather than finding evidence for it. And this one, it happens in evolution a lot. Fossils are dated based on the rock strata they are found in, while the rock strata is dated based on the fossils that are in them. This assumes the predetermined age of the fossil to date the rock and the predetermined age of the rock to date the fossil, creating a closed loop. Another common example is species evolved because they're here. If they hadn't evolved, you wouldn't see them. That is not a logical argument, nor is it a scientific argument. It is a circular argument. So it's a fallacy because it's a logical error using the conclusion as the basis for your argument without giving independent evidence to prove it. So this is kind of what people say all the time about you're interpreting everything to confirm your own belief. You're not actually looking at evidence. All right, we got three more, and these are very common. You guys should see these a lot. You have the bandwagon appeal, arguing that a claim is true because many people believe it. You heard this one about global warming. You must believe that human activity causes 100% of global warming because 97% of scientists agree that it does. So if 97% of people believe something, I just have to trust them? Like, there's no evidence for it, but the majority of people believe it, so it has to be true. No, that is false. And by the way, that statistic was a deliberate lie, just so you're aware. 97% of scientists did not agree. It was the Council on Global Warming had people who attended who were speaking about global warming who were all scientists. I think it was like 3,000 scientists. They were all sent a questionnaire about global warming. And 97% of the people who were attending the conference to tell people that global warming was caused by humans, 97% of those scientists agreed with that. It's not 97% of scientists in any institution. It was 97% of scientists who already agreed that global warming was a human problem, agreed that it was a human problem, which should be a red flag when people say that about global warming, because that means out of all the scientists who are determined to push climate change on people and blame humans for it, 3% of those people who already agreed to do that don't agree with it. That's a huge red flag that that is a lie and you shouldn't believe in that stuff. Anyways, that's a bandwagon appeal. Well, everyone else does, so you should too. Then you have an appeal to authority, and we saw this in recent years too, claiming something is true because an expert says it is. Dr. Fauci says, Bill Gates says, or my pastor says, Therefore, it's true, and I'll believe it and demand everyone else believe it without question because I'm going to trust the science. That is a logical fallacy, and not a single scientist out there called anybody out on it. Well, I should say on national television or in the governments of the world. But the appeal to authority is a logical fallacy and proves that you don't have evidence. So when they said trust the science, that's proving that they know they're wrong. That's logic. Okay. Last one is causal fallacy. And this one's more funny than anything else. But it's assuming that because one event followed another, the first event caused the second event. So I wore my lucky socks to the game and we won the game. Therefore, my socks caused us to win. Logical fallacy. All right. Now, here's my point with all of this. It is very important that we understand that logic and absolute truth go together. It is not just an opinion. You do not, an opinion, listen, an opinion is a personal belief, judgment, or sentiment about a subject that is not based on proof or certainty or absolute fact. So you are not entitled to your opinion on truth, facts, logic, math, etc. Because then it's not an opinion. An opinion is something that is what you believe based on something that does not have proof or certainty. So you might choose not to believe something that is demonstrably true. Then it's not your opinion. It is a false belief that you have. You are allowed to have opinions on things like metaphysics, spirituality, your likes and dislikes. Immaterial things that cannot be proven are everybody's opinion. You see the difference? So don't let people tell you, well, that's your opinion on the Bible. When the Bible says something in black and white, that's what it means. It's not your opinion. Okay. The rules of logic are like the rules of mathematics. They are inherent and immutable. They are a property of existence. They are not anyone's opinions. They are not subject to opinion. 2 plus 2 always equals 4. The rules of logic are always true and must always be and must always be followed. If you reject the rules of logic, then you might as well acknowledge that triangular circles exist. Because all rational thought disintegrates at that point if you reject logic. Cause and effect relationship always operate based on the rules of logic. So if you deny the rules of logic, you're also denying cause and effect, and therefore science itself. Math relies on the rules of logic. Anyone who's ever taken geometry has been introduced to proofs. They are simple logic problems. For example, the sum of all the angles of any triangle, the inner perimeter, those angles equal 180 degrees. That's the nature of being a triangle. 3 sides. So for a certain triangle, A, B, and C, angle A is 90, angle B is 45. If they all have to add up to be 180, therefore angle C is also 45 degrees. The conclusion is made absolutely necessary by the premise, cause and effect. If the sum of the angles of triangles equal 180 degrees, and you know what 2 of the angles are, then the last thing is absolutely true. You will know the third angle. Angle C cannot be anything other than 45. That is logic. It's not an opinion. It is an inherent property of the universe that absolutely must be accepted by a sane individual. If you reject the rules of logic, you also reject the rules of mathematics. Now, we're going to get into philosophy now because logic is philosophical, but you need logic in every other aspect of philosophy as well. So we had to cover that before we get into basic philosophy. So until next time, keep searching for truth.